Well, welcome to the Bryan Gallery. My name's Dave Johnson. I teach photography, and I've been at Coastal for, this is now my 3rd year. So if you're interested in photography, come find me. My office is down the hallway. We have a photo minor. I rewrote the curriculum to bring in all sorts of different kind of interests. So if you like fashion or sports, the photography minor is for you. But the big thing with this show is when I started at Coastal, our past gallery director, Jim, was like, hey, we haven't had a photo show in a while, do you want to try to bring one in? And I knew that my friends, Francis Jacobet and Meg Griffiths, were organizing a Yellow Rose project. This is 46 pieces from 46 female identified artists that are all thinking about the 19th Amendment. Who knows what the 19th Amendment is? I've been talking all day. Good. So, and these are all contemporary artists that are as young as 25, artists that are all as old as 75. So it's a really inclusive show. I also think this show is really interesting because it shows kind of how expressive photography can be, from scans of newspaper articles to lighting studio arrangements to where artists are working back on prints by sewing and needle threading. So it shows that photography can be expansive. It shows that it's a language that can look through and mine through archives. So this is just a portion of the show. There's a QR code on the side of the wall right here. This takes you to a Yellow Rose Project website where they have 104 artists that have multiple pieces that are thinking about the 19th Amendment. Our video screens are cycling through all 104 artists. So it's a very, very large, robust collection of artists that are working today that are thinking about the 19th Amendment. I am so thankful to be at Coastal because we can have collaborations like this, where we can bring in art and have panel discussions with other faculty across the campus. I'm so excited to see so many of y'all are here for this, but I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to let the panel take over and give us words of wisdom for today. But thank y'all for being here. The gallery always has art up. Come hang out. It's a good place to relax and hang out. When we have an opening, there's always food for students for free. So come through next time you hear about a gallery opening.
Great.
Thank y'all so much.
Thank you. Let's thank Dave for welcoming us. Thanks, Professor Johnson, for inviting us. He emailed me in the spring and said, we're going to have a really cool exhibit in the art gallery. Would you be interested in having an event in this space while we have the traveling exhibit here? And I thought, oh, that sounds fantastic. So this was back in April, or March or April. And so I thought, well, since it's about the 19th Amendment, we should do something on women in voting, because it's a little bit after the 100-year anniversary now. But, we're still around that 100-year mark where we can really take stock of and see how things have changed for women in terms of what voting has done for women and how it's changed the political landscape. So I put together this panel. This was before we had a woman candidate on the ballot for president, so that just happened to emerge, obviously, during the summer. So that was not the intention. The intention here was not political in my sense, in terms of wanting to have something that was like, okay, we're going to talk about women in voting now. It was like, oh, we already planned this. So that being said, we're going to have, we have a fantastic panel here where we're going to talk about a lot of the issues that have come up with women in voting. We're going to look at some of the history. We're going to look at some of the challenges. So let me just introduce you. Oh my goodness, I totally forgot to say, my name is Dr. Chaletta Oxley, and I direct the Jackson Family Center for Ethics and Values. I'm housed in the philosophy department, and I teach courses in philosophy, primarily ethics. And so welcome to you all for coming. I know I have some of my own students in the room, but I'm looking forward to getting to know the rest of you that are here also. So let me just briefly introduce our panel, and we'll go ahead and get started. So we have Dr. Justin Vaughn from Political Science. Dr. Vaughn specializes in polling and looking at people's attitudes towards different races and different candidates. Races in terms of congressional races and presidential races. He also has a sort of well-known project on presidential greatness, which he's gotten a lot of press on, so we're very excited to have him with us today. We also have Dr. Ina Siethaler, who is from the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. She has a specialization in various aspects of feminism, and immigration, immigration and language and things like that. So she's got some really cool things to share with us. Finally, we have Dr. Wendy Weinhold, who is from the communication department, and she specializes in the media and in issues of gender in the media. So we'll be looking at some of those issues as well. Let me just give you an idea of how things are going to go today. I have some prepared questions that I'm going to ask the panel. I should also say we have Pat Shaman here. Pat, will you please stand up? Pat is from the League of Women Voters, and I'm going to ask Pat to say a few words. Maybe, let me just finish my sentence, and then I'm going to ask her to say something. So what we'll do is I'm going to let Pat make a statement, and then I've got some prepared questions that I'm going to ask. We're going to have questions from the audience at the end of the event. So we're going to stop with around 15 minutes or so remaining and take questions from the audience. But I've got some ones that we can get started with. So if there's anything that you'd like to specifically touch on, just make your notes, and at the end, just raise your hand. So I'm also going to invite Pat to come. Pat really has the logistics of how voting works. And so the League of Women Voters has been around for a long time, and I'm just going to ask her to come and say something about the League of Women Voters and its goals. And then at the end, she's going to give us some real specific tidbits that if you're going to be voting, here's what you need to look for. Here's the issues you need to research. Here's what your ballot's going to look like, that kind of thing. So Pat, come on and welcome to the stage. Let's welcome Pat.
I'm glad to be here today, to be able to share just a few things. League of Women Voters, of course, has been around 104 years, and that, as you probably can guess, coincides in 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So what the suffragists and the leaders of the whole movement realized was that you need help to administer, and you need public education on why this broader vote is important. And you got to keep it. And so I think we can all see today how, with many of our rights, you got to work to keep it. So League of Women Voters is still going on. Men join League of Women Voters as well. And there's two main thrusts of it. The nonprofit side, it's a political, nonpartisan grassroots organization. Okay, so every state can set up the League of Women Voters. A lot of local, we're Oregon County. My passion is getting everybody ready to vote and getting 100% someday. So that's process information, making sure you have all the info and access to voting. The other side is advocacy. So there's many issues that, of course, we champion, like working on things that, like redistricting, or the ERA, or voting rights, of course, equality, public education, environment, healthcare. So all those things that apply to everybody in a healthy democracy. So that's what League of Women Voters is about. And since women tend to vote in higher numbers than men, it's good.
Okay, awesome. All right, well, we'll just go ahead and get started, and I'll start with my questions. All right, so I'd like to talk a little bit about the historical context. What was happening when women were seeking the right to vote, which we've got, a lot of images here that are being represented to to give a better sense of what was going on in the early 1900s. What specific rights were women seeking, and how did this all come about? Can you say something about the historical context? How did men react? How about, was this a white movement? Was this an interracial movement? Can you give us just more context of the passage of the 19th Amendment? And whoever wants to start.
I can go ahead.
Great.
Not that I'm a historian, folks, but I'll try my best. In Women's and Gender Studies, we have kind of labeled the movement that was going on and that led to the ratification of the 19th Amendment liberal feminism. Really what that means stands in comparison to radical feminism in the 1960s and 70s. Really what that is trying to capture is the idea that women at the time just wanted to become part of the system. So there actually was huge hope that if they got the right to vote, that there would be equity, that there would be liberation for women. Women at the time did not have the right, for example, to own property. They did not have the right to divorce. In the cases of divorce, they did not have the right to their own children, to custody over their own children. And, you know, so they really thought that if they can just become part of the system, they can fix the system. This changed in the 60s and 70s, and that's why we call it radical feminism, because folks then kind of recognized, well, getting the vote didn't really fix the issues for us. It wasn't this, you know, magical tool that got us equity. And so the system actually is completely messed up, and we have to get rid of the system. But in you know, the early, what we call the first wave of feminism, the idea really was the system is okay, we just want to be part of the system. In terms of the historical part, one piece that's definitely also important to mention, and Dr. Oxley, you mentioned kind of issues around race and class. It is really important to emphasize that the 19th Amendment really only gave white women the right to vote. It was, you might know this, but I think it was about like 23 or 25 million women that at the time were allowed to vote. This did not include Native American women, for example, because indigenous populations did not have citizenship at the time. That came in 1924. But even then, due to racist policies, most folks of color were kept from actually being able to vote. Immigrants of Asian descent were not allowed to become United States citizens until 1952. So immigrant women from Asia were not allowed to vote until 1952. And again, even then, racist policies kept them from doing so. Certainly black women were discouraged through literacy tests, poll taxes, and just the sheer threat of violence, right? This was one of the major reasons that the KKK formed, is to keep black folks from voting. So black women were virtually, most, especially poor black women, were kept from voting up until 1965. And even then, there was no kind of magical cure right away. So maybe I'll leave it at that, and let others maybe chime in. But that's kind of a historical overview of what women really were hoping to accomplish. If you are interested in the historical piece, there's two really good movies that I'm going to recommend. One is Ironclad Fist. I'm looking at the movie person, and the other one is Suffragette. One is set in the UK and one is set in the US. They both do a fantastic job because it's incredibly admirable what these women did. They got arrested. They were force-fed in prison because they went on hunger strike. So there was an incredible level of violence that they experienced that I think we don't talk about enough, right? They really put their bodies on the line to get the right to vote. It was seen as incredibly unpatriotic, and that's a kind word to use, to protest the president during time of war. World War I was going on at the time, and it was just seen as absolutely a no-go. And a lot of these women, you know, still went for it at incredible personal risk. And there's a lot that we have to be thankful for. There was unfortunately also, and maybe predictably, a lot of racism going on in the movement though as well that I want you to be aware of. You know, there's a lot to be said about that as well.
And building on what Dr. Seehaler just said, it's really important to recognize that when we think about suffragettes, when we think about the women in 1920 who are largely celebrated, your Elizabeth Cady Stanton, your big names, they were critically important, but they had the solidarity and the support of a number, particularly of black women who worked alongside them, fought alongside them, and engaged in a variety of activism, protest, advocacy for women's rights, and then often were left by the wayside by their white women counterparts who successfully gained the right to vote, but didn't keep these allies, these black women who had done the work along with them, in the game. And that is one of the really tragic parts of, and often unspoken parts of the amendment and of the fight that we fought in the 1920s for the right to vote, is that it was a claim for votes for women, but it was really just votes for a particular kind of woman, and that was a white woman. So.
Not a lot. I think that the historical pattern dovetails with that shift from liberal feminism to radical feminism, where Just like when African American men got the right to vote, the 15th Amendment after the Civil War, other than the brief period during Reconstruction, there was a long time before that was actually realized, a century, which was realized about the same time that women's right to vote became much more prevalent, and then also started to turn into policy successes, whether through getting descriptive representation in elected office or through Supreme Court cases. But it took a generation or more for the amendment to lead to real changes in electoral outcomes of public policy.
Yeah, it's a surprisingly long time, because I think the convention was in 1848, and then then we had, so 52 years. I'm sorry, 72 years. It is an entire lifetime.
That's the Seneca Falls Convention.
Sorry,
that
Seneca
Dr.
Falls
Oxley is
Convention,
referring to.
yes.
It's kind of the first women's rights convention in New York. Seneca Falls is a town, if any of you are from New York.
I'm from Cameron, but I
I just went for the first time this summer, and there's a really, really neat historic site, a museum that the U.S. National Park is actually running. If you ever make it up there, I really encourage you to check it out. It's a great experience, and it's free.
All right, road trip. All right, so I'd like to now hear a little bit more about the impact of women getting the right to vote. And there's a couple different ways I want to consider quote unquote impact. And I guess the first question is, how much have women voted over the years? Like, did it start off with like 10% of white women or 50%, or did like everybody rush out to the polls because they were so excited to vote? And then like, how has this changed over the years? Do we know much about voter participation for women in the last 100 years? And I think, Justin, maybe you might have some data on that.
Yeah, so after the first presidential election after the 19th Amendment, there was a pretty significant turnout for women. It was 35 to 45%. There's an estimate, it's not a real hard number. To compare, that was versus about 68% of men. So they voted at, probably half to maybe a little bit better than half the rate of men. But going from nothing to 35 to 45% is quite significant. Right? That of that group of women who had received the franchise at the 19th Amendment, a large number of them took advantage of it, right? And then since then, we've seen kind of that gap between the men and women not only close, but women start to create a gap on the other side, right? So in every election since 1980, the female voter turnout rate has been higher than the male voter turnout rate. And if we're looking at just at raw numbers, in every election since 1964, more women have voted in this way. And so there's a number of, I think, reasons why, that we don't know exactly why, but a kind of a constellation of reasons that are typically cited are, more amorphous political socialization idea that, and perhaps because the fight for voting equality was so recent, there's a greater feeling of preciousness or more deeply held commitment to using that right to vote. Perhaps that explains some of it. But then there's also some, women have longer life expectancies, so women make up a majority of voting age Americans, particularly among minority communities, and the impacts of mass incarceration. There's a large percentage of non-white potential voters that are men that are in prison, and so whether it's for health advantages or systemic kind of criminal justice reasons, there are just more women who could vote in any given election than men. But even still, the rate at which they vote is usually a few points higher. So, for example, in the 2020 presidential election, 63% of women turned out to vote versus 59.5% of men. So pretty similar, but 3.5% is not nothing. Similarly, in 2016, 58% of women, almost 54% of men, so a little bit more than 4% difference there. 2012, it was 58.5% women, 54% men. So we've seen numbers kind of stable. The 2020 election had a very high turnout, and so the numbers for both men and women were higher. But we are seeing that, few digit percentage advantage for women in terms of voter turnout, and larger if we're just talking about raw numbers.
Cool, that's Do you guys have any follow-up thoughts?
I would add, I think from a kind of women's and gender studies perspective, there tends to be more at stake for women in our society, or for minoritized folks in general, right? And so the ideal to vote and hopefully try and bring about change that way, I would assume that could be a motivator as well.
And there is recent research and information related to simple voter registration, and all in this room, most of you are in the age group 19 to 29, and you all are part of the least registered to vote age group that exists in the age group. So if you don't want me, or your parents, or your grandparents, or your aunts and uncles making choices about your future, get registered to vote. Coastal has a program. It's extremely important. The lowest, just barely above a majority, just barely above 50% of people in the age range 19 to 29 are registered to vote. And that makes people like us desperately sad, because we want you engaged in your future. We want you engaged in making active choices about who it is who's going to control, the future of our country.
That's an excellent segue into what I can just bring your attention to. We actually have some set up in the back where you can register to vote. So Coastal's having the Vote 1954 initiative, where our goal is to get 1,954 students registered to vote by, I think the deadline's coming up soon. I think it's October 3rd, is that right? 4th. Okay, so that's next Friday. So if you haven't...
October 6th online.
Thank you. So Leah Levert is here, and she is in charge of this initiative. So if you haven't registered to vote yet, you can see them back in the corner. All you do is swipe the little QR code, and you can get registered. So no excuses. It'll also tell you where to register. I recognize that a lot of students are out of state. And you can answer questions whether you should be registering in South Carolina or at home. I don't know the answers to that question right now. So I'll just punt and ask those questions later on afterwards so you can register. So, okay, excellent. Thank you for that. Okay, so continuing on to this question about impact. So obviously when women got the right to vote, they also got the right to run for office. And I'm assuming that they didn't have the right to run for office prior to having the right to run for to vote. And so since women have started getting elected into political office, now my question is, what's the rate at which women get elected to political office? So that could include mayors or state legislatures, the national legislature. Obviously, we haven't had a woman president, so we know that. But what are some of the trends that we have with women who are actually running for office? You guys can all.
So there's a similar story with the election outcomes as there is with voting, unsurprisingly, right? So 1920, all these doors open, but it takes a while before a large number of women are utilizing the new right to vote, right? But around the same time that women become a majority of voters, they also start to get elected in increasing numbers. And they also start to see laws like the Voting Rights Act change, right? And so, and Supreme Court decisions that lead to access to reproductive health, whether birth control or abortion, right? So things start to change at the exact same time they become majority voters, which is not a coincidence in a democratic society, right? But you didn't start to really see any meaningful number of women or female representation in elected office until beginning to the 1970s. So in 1971, you had women making up 3% of the seats in Congress, right? For the 535 members of the House and Senate, 3% of them were women. 7% of statewide elective offices, so governor, lieutenant governor, treasurer, whatever the different states elect statewide, 7% of those were women. None were in state legislative seats, right? And so, so you had very low gender representation in 1971. Most recently, there's been a dramatic increase, but obviously still not equity. 28% of Congress is represented by women, so up from 3 to 28, still not close to half, but but dramatically more than it was. Statewide elective office went from 7% in 1971 to 32% this most recent election, and 0% in state legislative to 33% in state legislative seats. So we're seeing, and if we kind of look at other kinds of offices, we'll see kind of the similar numbers. And like women are kind of stuck at about a third or maybe a little bit less, and regardless of where they're at, right? So they currently hold 25% of the seats in the United States Senate, 29% of the seats in the United States House, 24% of U.S. governors, 44% of the U.S. lieutenant governors, including our own lieutenant governor, is a woman in South Carolina, 32% of other statewide elective office, 33% of state legislative seats, 32% of municipal office positions in cities more than 10,000 people, 27% of the mayors in cities over 30,000 people, 1/3 of the mayors of the 100 most populous cities in the country. So all these,
One vice president.
and one vice president, right? All of these offices, you're seeing the same kind of percentage, right? You're between 24 and well, I guess lieutenant governors are an aberration, but 24 and 37% are of female representation, regardless of the level. So it's not like we're necessarily more likely to elect women at the local level or the state level than the federal level. We're pretty equally likely to elect them, regardless of level.
Okay, that's a question.
Aren't we at like less than 13% in South Carolina? Isn't it?
Yes, we are. We are at the fourth lowest representation of women in 50 states, and we have just over 16%.
Oh.
And that brings to my mind sort of two organizations that I want to point to. South Carolina Women in Leadership is an organization that helps to support and encourage women to get involved in running for state office and running in local offices, because it's highly unlikely, if your aspiration is president, like mine was when I was little Wendy, the way you begin to get to that space is generally by running at the local level, or by pursuing a career that is the product of a college education that then equips you with the privilege, esteem, financial freedom, mobility to be able to go on to a state office, to be able to go on to a federal office. And if we don't have women at those starting spots, we can't get to the final spots, right? So organizations like South Carolina Women in Leadership is a great way, if you're interested, to begin exploring how to do that and how to support women who are doing that. You don't have to do it yourself. You can just give money to women who are able to and who are interested in it. Another organization that I really want to point out is a great organization called Emily's List, EMILY ''S, and it stands for Early Money is Like Yeast. It's not a woman's name, Emily, Emily is a catchy way to say it. But Early Money is Like Yeast, the organization recognizes that you've got to have money to start if you're going to finish. And when we talk about women being able to run successfully, the only way they get to a successful sort of position as a candidate is if they've got money to start out. And Emily's List is a great organization that supports women in a variety of spaces and a variety of candidacies by getting money to them as they start their candidacy, so they can get the momentum to get money to finish the candidacy successfully.
Very cool. I'll give a shout out to Dr. Caitlin Zadorsky, who is now at a school in New Jersey, but she wrote a whole book about women that are being appointed into positions. So, it's one thing to talk about elections, but there's also important conversations we had about how much do women get appointed into positions, because it's also fewer than men. So she wrote a whole book about it. Check it out. It's super fascinating. She did a whole study on that. But that's kind of the other important aspect when we talk about political representation. Again, Women's and Gender Studies is really interested in kind of questioning why don't we have more women in leadership positions in general, right? And so we're interested in understanding socialization processes that might make us, create these biases that associate leadership skills with masculine skills, things that we have labeled, coded as traditionally masculine. So aggression, for example, right? Or domination, kind of being harsh, controlling other people. interrupting people, during conversations. These are all things that we, if you did a survey, people would associate with leadership skills, and those are, very masculine attitudes. Not biologically, but we as a society have decided that that's what we associate with them. And so, speaking of organizations, I want to draw your attention to an initiative that's called Ban Bossy. Because there are studies that suggest that young girls that are confronted or with the term bossy or being labeled as bossy are much less likely to seek any kind of leadership positions later on, because they associate being outspoken, being visible, being in a leadership position essentially as negative, because you get called bossy. And then of course the adult version of it would be bitchy, right? And so there's something that we're doing as a society to really socialize, young girls to not have the confidence to want to take on leadership positions, and that holds true in the political realm as well. There's studies that show that up until age 9 or 10, young boys and girls, if we stay within kind of the binary of the genders, it's the only way that you're measuring things right now, unfortunately, they want to become president at the same rate. And then once they hit about 10 years old, women's self-confidence and their ability to see themselves in that role plummet really drastically. The hope, of course, would be that with a woman president, that might change, right, to have that representation. We'll see.
Good. So that actually kind of tags into a question that I had about how women are represented in politics. And we know that the media obviously plays a role in pitching how women are understood. So can you say just a little bit about what the role of media is in representing women in politics?
Yeah, I'm opening up my screen just so I can get my citations correct.
Yeah.
For those of you who are my students who are here, I'm so glad to see you. I've got sign-up sheets sitting right on my computer, waiting at the end to give you your extra credit, or if you're one of my wonderful 9 graduate students, to give you your credit for the class that we're all skipping right now to be doing. So, citationally, there's a really important amount of research on this topic, and the topic, if you're interested in going back and doing your own research, is called gender mediation. And the idea of gender mediation comes from feminist media studies, which is largely a school of thought in communication discipline and media disciplines, founded by a scholar named Lisbeth Van Zunen. And there's a number of scholars. Linda Trimble is another really important one. Karen Wall-Jurgensen is another really important one. And they all research the ways that media and those kind of stereotypes that Ina discussed really play into our ability to accept, to reward, and to even acknowledge the existence of a woman running for election or being in an elected role. And so they talk about the ways that, quote, all but the most competitive, novel, or high-profile women politicians are less visible, receive less stories in the media, are quoted in way less frequently than men are, and all of these studies show that there's a lot of ways that the media work to surveil, work to discipline, and work to erase women candidates. Women candidates, when they're shown in both television video, and if you say, oh, I don't watch television, you're watching it, whether you're watching it on YouTube, or on TikTok, or on Instagram, or on a box that's a typical television. You're watching TV, and that TV typically represents women candidates and women politicians in static and inactive poses, whereas men are shown with their hands up, are shown gesturing, whereas women are static, their hands are down, we look meek, and we look demure, and it's a popular word right now. I appreciate the giggles. And men are celebrated and recognized for those active roles where they are allowed, encouraged to be combative, in part because media today feeds into getting our attention, getting our clicks, getting our likes, and that means news that treats politics like it's a game, not like it's an election between 2 candidates, but like it's a competition, and that's often really deeply a gendered competition. And the way the media represent candidates is extremely different and often very detrimental toward women. So let me give you an example from scholar Dustin Hart, who's in Texas, who wrote a book about Hillary Clinton's run for presidency in 2016. And she talked about the media's role in the primaries and then in the general election, and the ways that the media covered the election debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And there was, the first debate was at a university, and I can't remember the name of the university, but they had very controlled amounts of time for breaks for the candidates, and those were controlled by television and television ads. At the university where the debate was held, outside of the stage where the debate was held was immediately the men's bathroom. But because it was a university, there was an old university that was built a long time ago when only men were able to attend, the women's bathroom was literally on the 4th floor of the building. And so Hillary Clinton needed to pee, which is an entirely human thing outside of her gender to do when you're forced to be on stage for a long period of time. And she went to the bathroom and had to rush. And she got back late simply because, you know, it took her a human amount of time to walk, go to the bathroom, come back to the stage. And they didn't allow her the time. They went straight back on camera to just Trump standing on the stage alone and never acknowledged in their media coverage about the debate why it was that Trump was alone, why it was that Clinton was late. There was certainly coverage about it, but it was coverage questioning and conspiracy theories about was Clinton running away, was she trying to duck out, et cetera, et cetera. Had there been just some basic good journalism, some basic good news coverage of the sexist system involved in the ways that bathroom construction works at our universities, that could have been taken care of. But often, that doesn't get taken care of. And so, there we go. That's my story.
Good, yeah. So does anybody else want to chime in and talk about how women, like what stereotypes? I mean, you talked a little bit about bossy and bitchy and all these things. Like what other kinds of, like do women get judged harder in certain ways that men don't? Like what kind of, like unequal treatment are women and men given in terms of how they're represented to the public?
I'll just focus on one thing that did receive a good amount of attention, both on the popular side but also the academic side during the 2016 run, and that was this idea of likability. So, you know, women are held to much higher standards and very different standards when it comes to likability. I mean, I imagine that many of you in this room have been told to smile at some point by a stranger, and that is connected with this idea of like women are supposed to, you know, please the people around us, right? We're supposed to be nurturing, and that means that we're supposed to be just pleasant all the time. And that's a standard that we simply do not hold men to at the same degree. Because again, we associate masculinity actually with aggression and with not showing emotions. And so that is something that has received a lot of attention because it's an impossible standard to hit. Again, if you look at the kind of news coverage about any type of female politician, and some of the most important ones and most powerful ones, like Nancy Pelosi, for example, until recently. I hope that may mean something to you. If not, you're out. But the idea always was, you know, again, you can't win because you're never going to reach these unrealistic ideas of the likability levels that women have to reach. And so, you know, there's just a lot more pressure put on women to navigate how they give interviews, what they wear, how they look, and then how they sound, for sure. Right? And so it's just a lot more pressure and energy that women really invest in how they present themselves.
Yeah. Women are punished for having children when it comes to candidacies and when it comes to their political experience. Men are rewarded for being dads. Men get credit, women don't. Women are only allowed to be happy. Women are not allowed to be angry. There's all kinds of ways that our behaviors, our experiences, our identities are disciplined and surveilled in the ways that they are.
One else, there's a friend of mine named Meredith Conroy who does really interesting work on gender and perceptions and portrayals and candidate strategies. Has written a lot of really, she has a really interesting book about kind of how the presidency is masculinized, about how different candidates can lean into different stereotypes or have to deal with those stereotypes. And in some cases, less probably frequently, the masculine expectations can play against men, right? I know there was, when George W. Bush and John Kerry ran, when Bush was being reelected in 2004, there was a significant and probably successful effort to demasculinize John Kerry, right? Who had been a war hero, and fought in Vietnam, right? Instead they, but also had kind of a, I don't know, New England patrician style, and but great efforts were made to make him seem kind of feminine, soft, and it probably cost him some percentage of votes. But so some of Meredith's work looks at what kinds of stereotypes women have to deal with, but then also what kinds of female candidates are allowed to lean into the counter stereotypes, right? So generally Republican or conservative women candidates can lean into these masculine stereotypes and it can work. But Democratic female candidates can't do that the same way, right? And so you see, and there's still guardrails, right? So you see Sarah Palin able to take on some aggressiveness, and when she was the vice presidential candidate for John McCain, but she still had to do it in the context of being a mom, right? So she said she's a hockey mom, and but there was an element of what a hockey mom means. There's an element of violence to it, right?
Mama bear.
Right. And whereas, again, there's this element of violence, right? I care for my young, but I'm going to kill you, as opposed to a soccer game, right? Whereas Hillary Clinton, when she tries to lean into it by doing shots of whiskey, drinking beers with factory workers, right? It's routinely parodied and rejected. Now, those are two examples that there probably are other reasons why things work for Palin, didn't work for Clinton, beyond just kind of gender. But they're good examples, I think, of where a Republican was able to, in a savvy way, lean into it. Kristi Noem in South Dakota, until she went too far with the dog killing, has consistently leaned into this aggressiveness, but also very, leans into her very feminine appearance. So it should show, even the Republicans have to balance that, right? But on the other side, it just wouldn't work. And that could be as much about Democratic voters as it could be about the Democratic candidates, right? That maybe Republican voters are willing to then say, oh, okay, I'll vote for this female candidate. She's kind of got this masculine thing going, where on a Democratic voter, they may say, oh, I'm not going to reward Hillary Clinton for that.
So you bring up a point which I guess is going to open the can of worms with respect to women, which is that women don't vote as a monolith, right? We have Republican women and Democratic women. And I know that women are in some sense socialized to not necessarily pull for each other, that we definitely are kind of socialized to distrust each other. I think that's changing with the current generation. There's a lot more cooperativeness that I see among women, and women complimenting other women. This never happened, I'm sorry to tell y'all, up until recently. That is not a thing. But I think it's fantastic. But that being said, what are some of the ways that either women are pitted against each other or women vote against each other? So the title of the panel is Women versus Women, right? And so we're clearly not working together as a whole because we don't seem to have shared goals or shared ideals. I just want to kind of open that can up and hear what y'all have to say about this issue of so much disagreement between women on what their interests are and what their goals are and their political motivations are.
I'll just start by acknowledging that it is really important that we make a distinction between groups of women, right? like with the right to vote, you can't say women got the right to vote in 1910. No, that's not true. Like, we have to look at race, at class, disability for that matter, right? And how all of our identity markers really come together and shape the experiences we get to have with oppression and privilege in our lives and under the systems that we all live in. So just to throw out some statistics that kind of just reaffirm, so black women, for example, are more likely to vote for the Democratic Party in 2016, and does it hold true for 2020? The majority of white women voted for Donald Trump, right? And so I think it's really interesting, at the very least, to look into how does race influence what is important to us, and what does that mean about which kind of party lines do we align? There's a lot to be said again about our cultural backgrounds and how that shapes what is really meaningful to us. Reproductive justice, the data show does play a huge role in this, right? So if your religious convictions, for example, tell you that abortion, that you don't want to support that, right, then it is fairly clear what kind of party you would vote for. From a women's and gender studies perspective, what we do is we kind of analyze, again, where is that messaging coming from, right? What does the role of religion play? But also, what does the role of internalized oppression play, right? About how we think about our bodies and the rights that we should have to our bodies. And again, how we turn that from, thinking and ideology and culture and how we were raised, or, our values into who we vote for. So really the main takeaway is it's useless to say women vote like this, because that's not an intersectional approach, and you really have to understand, issues of immigration background, and so on. That's just complicated. That's my job, by the way, so I'm okay with it.
Do you guys want to add anything to that? Anything about different voting trends for different women, different backgrounds, or different issues that might contribute?
Now, I think, and this is true for all groups of voters, that different things are salient at different times. And so now women, culturally or socially or societally, are kind of cross-pressured in different ways than most men are, in terms of having to balance the different expectations of their gender roles, right? But whatever is happening in the world will shape how people balance those cross-pressures. And so many of you probably have heard the phrase soccer mom, right? Which is described, it came up in the 1990s, described as a particular kind of mom that moderate Democrats were trying to target, right? And that they were not only focused on issues concerning reproductive rights or access to higher education or the workforce, for themselves, but also the education of their children, right? And so it became a different kind of way that moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats were able to try to compete for this vote, right? And then after 9/11, one of the things that we started to hear were that the soccer moms were not as interested in education anymore. They were actually much more interested in national security issues, just like most Americans were. And so they started saying things like national security moms. And the Republicans did a lot better with these voters because national security after 9/11 was at top of mind, right? And that access to the education for their children had come down in importance a little bit because, World Trade Center just got blown up and we were fighting 2 wars in the Middle East or Central Asia. And right now, I think that you'll see many female voters, like many other voters, be very, very focused on the economy, right? And that might take greater precedence than access to education for their children, which is a little more of a post-materialist thing than being able to put food on the table for your children right now, right? But what's really changed, unlike all of those election cycles, is that reproductive rights is front and center as an electoral issue. It's always been a thing that people talk about and that Democrats have campaigned on, and to some degree Republicans in different ways have campaigned on. But it is much more perceived as an electoral matter, even though it's not an electoral matter, right? It's not gonna, if Kamala Harris wins or Donald Trump wins, it's not gonna change what happens to access to abortion next year or for 5 years, right? But it's highly mobilizing, and so that could be top of mind, right? Some nexus of access to reproductive health and the economy, right? But you know, I think when we think about this, we have to thread this needle between understanding that women, like any other group, are not monolithic. That women, unlike other groups, have different sets of expectations they navigate, or responsibilities, or different hats they wear, however you want to think about it. But then also, like everyone, that whatever is happening in the world around us affects us. And we're all living in a troubled economy. We're all living in an era of distrust of civic elites. We're all living in a lot in the current moment, which affects all of us, right? You know, in addition to, through, and regardless of our gender.
Right. Well, so what I'd like to do at this point, we've got about 10 minutes left. I'd like to open to questions from the audience. So I'll just take a hand. So I have one hand directly in front of me. Do I have other hands for anybody in the room? Okay, go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll move on to the next person.
These aren't really questions, but these are statements that you guys can either agree with or disagree with, which are pretty, I'd say I'm pretty knowledgeable on a lot of things. But these are just random points that I've heard throughout your conversations, and just to kind of bring it for you guys. I feel like we do that because on that age group, we don't really have anything to unite our age group as a global front. There's so many things that divide us in our age group right now that people may feel like our votes don't matter due to the challenges to the electoral college, where I believe a popular vote, which this will never happen because it's like radical belief, where a popular vote election would be a lot better in my opinion. And I was like, so why is that? I think it's due to this idea that patriarchy and this idea is part of society is overcome. Because to me, if half the global population is women, that means half the decisions should also be left up to women. And I said, for me, it feels like our two candidates in general aren't radical enough. They don't seem like two candidates that will actually seem to change the status quo for women or existence or society. Kamala seems pretty centrist, while Trump is obviously conservative. And I have this question, like when you think of the sex object, what gender do you think of typically? You don't think of men, you think of women, so that goes along with like what you were saying about women being or having rougher challenges than men. And I put like something along the lines like it's more okay for a male to be obese compared to a woman. Like I'm obese, right? Just objectively. And it's okay for me to be fat, but it's not okay for a woman to be fat, and that's wrong. And I also put, you're talking about angry, like it's weird for a woman to be angry, and there's a word for that. They call them divas, or they call them drama queens. And to me, the problem is so systemic, and it's just rooted in our language. I mean, even when you think of the word humanity, what word is in that? Man. It's not called humanity. You know, it's like a systemic problem that's even rooted in our culture, in our
All right,
language.
that's fantastic. I feel like you've said so much that these people can answer to. So, did you hear a question there? Anything that you want to
What's
talk
your
about?
name?
Luke.
Hi, Luke. Yeah, I mean, like, you really get there, Luke, to a lot of the double binds that women face, right? I mean, I was thinking as I was listening to Dr. Vaughn's notes about and answers to the most recent question. I mean, what we're really thinking about when it comes to the what gets women to vote and why women vote the way they do, often the things that you listed, whether it's September 11th or it's reproductive rights, or also I would add, gun control is a major issue in this campaign, in part because of what you all as a generation have gone through that none of us ever went through. When I was a little kid in elementary school, we had tornado drills in Nebraska, a state that's currently fighting with its electoral college choices. And all y'all grew up post-Columbine with gun drills, right? And that's a huge issue that I think has sort of been labeled a mom issue, but it's a parenting issue, should be an American issue. And women face this double bind of, we've got skin in the game, to use a war term, like it's September 11th, there's men, sons, and daughters going to war, and so we want to be involved, or there's, sons and daughters, husbands and wives, men and women who have reproductive rights being taken away from them, and we want to be involved in that. Now that we have children in schools, and we have, women and men who are working in teaching and administration who become in danger, and so we want to make changes. And yet, figuring out how to make those changes does mean changing the system, but it means changing our whole way of thinking. And that's a very difficult thing to do. It really does take that kind of radical shift that we haven't accomplished. I don't know if we will accomplish, but there's
too much.
I'm not moving to Canada next year. I'm not moving to Italy next year. I'm staying here. I hope all of you are too, to finish your degrees. And as a result, we have to make active choices about the world we're living in. And we've got to stop thinking about the sound of someone's laugh or the color of someone's skin, and instead think about what it is that is best for our country, is best for us all.
And that's kind of like what I was agreeing with you on. Sorry.
That's okay, just quickly, and then I'd like to go to the other panels.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, it's okay, keep going.
I'm just grateful for the shout out to the patriarchy. So
Yeah.
if you want to learn more about that, please
For sure.
join us in a Women's and Gender Studies class. And please vote. I understand that it can seem frustrating and the system is frustrating, but there have been national votes that have been decided by 500 people, literally. And there is there's a lot of energy right now spent on making you think that your vote doesn't matter. There's a lot of energy right now spent on keeping people from voting through restricting the vote, through new voter ID laws, for example. In South Carolina, one thing that you will see on the ballot is a law that they want passed that only citizens can vote. That already is the case,
That is the
right?
law.
That is the law. But there's rhetoric around, there's so much voter fraud, and it doesn't matter, your vote doesn't matter. And that's all nonsense, so I need you to know that. And there is, if they want to keep you from voting through every means possible, that means that they really don't want you to vote, and that they really care about you not voting, especially you young folks. And I just really, whatever I can do to encourage you to go vote, please do, because your vote absolutely matters.
Here's another question.
Yes, go ahead.
Earlier when you were talking about like Republican candidates being able to show more like masculine traits, were you talking about like a collectively as like a society, or do you think like party allegiance comes into play in that?
That's probably both, right? And I think the analysis I was talking about, they coded a lot of different ways that different candidates portray themselves, did statistical analyses, and showed that there was this partisan difference, right, for the kind of candidates who would win and be able to lead those stereotypes. But it's probably a combination of both of those things.
Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Sorry, I've got a data question, so it might be a bit more targeted. I was just curious, do we know if being a woman makes you more likely to vote for a woman, or less likely, or equal amounts? And if so, why? Like, do we have that data? And
Yeah, so it does. It also makes women are more likely than men to think a woman candidate will be a good leader. Women are more likely than men to think a woman candidate will be trustworthy, right? And that translates into women more likely to vote for other women.
All right, other questions? I'll stand up so I can see the whole audience. Yes, another one in the back.
What would you say towards people who, I've just heard even like rumblings, like just, being a college student, that there's discussions saying that, like for example, you guys were talking about earlier with pitted against each other within our society. And some people I've heard say, well, men are pitted against each other too. But my argument would say that they're pitted against each other in different ways. So from your experience on the panel, do you have different perspectives on how women have been pitted against each other that are different in the ways that men are?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, I love that question. Again, we dig into that in our classes, for sure. So again, the invitation to join us. But I think, again, because we actually value aggression in men, that, you know, men being pitted against each other and them actually engaging in aggressive behavior is actually something that we value. We find that a good thing, right? But not only do we as a society pit women against each other with, you know, like really petty things like who's more beautiful, who gets the man, right? It's like never about actual like intellectual things. Not only do we pit them against each other, but then we shame them for it. And we say, well, again, the whole bitchiness thing, and like, you know, or this is important right now, we have a whole trope about the angry black woman, for example, if we bring race into the conversation, right? Which of course is really applicable right now in the current race. So, so that's, to me, that's really the problem, right? Like we actually value this in men, and we see this as a strength, and that's helpful for leadership, but then we tell women that they can't support each other, they can't prop each other up, that they need to be fighting each other, and then we shame and blame them for doing that. And we see that in pop culture a ton. We talk about, I always joke with my pop culture students that, you know, you need to be emotionally prepared to have Disney ripped apart. But in Disney, you don't see any princess that has, you know, a friend, really. Or mom, well, or mom. So there's no female networks in support of each other, right? So we really raise children on that story that you need to be in competition with other women, but that you will be shamed for actually being competitive about like real things. And you know, my argument would be that that has real life implications, especially when it comes to leadership and politics.
Yeah, I mean, like you look at Hillary Clinton, for example, and you know, in her candidacy, she was blamed and shamed for Bill's infidelity. She, you know, was mocked for her laugh. She, you know, stood by her man, which was supposed to be what a good wife would do, right? And yet then blamed for standing by her man, while her husband won re-election for president, you know, while doing those things, and won election for president, and won election for governor, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the ways that women are judged and penalized are different than the ways that men are judged and penalized, or not.
These are all fantastic questions, and I would like to ask you all to hold them and maybe come and ask our panel afterwards, because we're really running a little bit late. And I'd like to invite Kat to come up to land the helicopter for us. So I love to have these really complex, theoretical, like amazing discussions. But now I want you to, some of you are going to be first-time voters this year, and she's going to come and talk to you about what your experience is and what to expect. So Pat, welcome. Come and take the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, there's several things that we'd like to reinforce in whatever table reading or festivals or whatever we can get to talk to folks. And the first thing is, most states now have early voting, so I hope you know when those dates are, if that's conducive to, you might not need an absentee ballot if you can get home in that time period to vote. So they're different states, starts here October 21st and for 2 weeks. We can talk more about that. Also, voter registration deadlines. Some states are really up close to voting day, and some states you need to be registered by next Friday or next weekend. So be sure to look that up for your state. Here it's next week. The biggest thing I want to advise, no matter where you live, is look at your sample ballot before you go vote. There's stuff on your ballot you might not expect. You don't want to be standing there going, oh no, I forgot about that. So, do we have a lot of South Carolina voters here? Okay, several. Yeah, there's two things in Morgan County. There's two things on our ballot. I'm sure many of the counties do, and in other states. They could have ballot questions. They could have constitutional questions. South Carolina, we have a constitutional amendment that was already mentioned. They just want to change one word from every to only. One is more inclusive, one's more restrictive, so think about those things before you get there. When you look at it, it's one line. It's about citizenship and voting rights. And one says everyone, 18, and a citizen, and one says, and that's what it currently says, everyone. It's inclusive. What they want to change every to is only. So people would look at that and say, well, that's no difference, that's good, it's all good. But why do we want to make that change? A lot of ballot questions will have an explanation and tell you why that change is important. We're not being told anything why that's important. Obviously, it's connected to some further activities some people want to take, but they're not sharing it with us. So anyway, that's something to think about. The second thing on our local ballot is a tax issue, a RIDE 4 program, 1% sales tax on everything. We pay for roads for the next 25 years. So there's a lot of elements to that, and it's about this long when you look at it on your ballot. Lots of words because it lists all the roads that we want to pave and extend or improve. So there's a lot of goodness in there. Right now, we do things by 8-year increments like that. They want to do it for 25 years. So think about that. Do we trust them all to do it for 25 years, or maybe we want to take it in pieces? Something to think about. So you definitely want to do that before you walk up to the voting machine. Poll workers. If that's something you're interested in, consider that. Each of your states has different rules about that. You apply at your county level. This is a presidential year. There's lots of stuff on your ballot, not just the president. So local elections mean a lot. They probably affect your life even more than the presidential selection. So consider learning much more about the candidates that are running their local level. I don't know if we have enough time, but one thing to watch out for is on your ballot, you have a lot of uncontested races. In Orange County, we have a lot of uncontested races. There's only one person running. So that would also lead you to feel like, well, my vote really doesn't mean much because I'm not going to vote for it here except 5 things out of 20. So obviously it's bigger than just a one voting cycle. We want to get more candidates. We want to have competition because if you don't have competition on a ballot, you don't have a discussion. The folks that run don't have to respond to questions, don't have to have a forum. They don't have a competitor. So one thing, there's a lot of online voter opportunities to register to vote, track your ballots. Those are number one. TurboVote that Canvas is using free. That's how you get registered to vote and get the information you need. What the Legal Women Voters has nationwide is a platform called 411.org, and that site helps you get registered to vote. But it also has one more feature, which I recommend to everybody, no matter what state you're in. Go to 411, vote 411, and we've asked the candidates in the districts that have this. They asked the candidates to respond to a couple of questions so we can prepare. Well, we've asked all the people in Lorraine County. We have a few responses, so I hope you go look and see if it's something useful to you. But we need voter pressure to make the candidates respond. So we need to build the psychology. When I grew up, you got a voter guide in the mail, just like paper. And all people my age come up to the table and say, why don't we have that voter guide anymore? Well, it costs a lot of money, just like all newspapers and print goods. So here's an online option to build that service, and we can get everybody to use it. So, got any other questions, please let me know, and I'll be happy to chat.
All right, thank you.